The room was silent except for the steady hum of a medical oxygen concentrator in the corner. Joseph Reed, a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran, sat reclined in his favorite armchair, its fabric worn thin from years of use. His weathered hands rested on his lap, one of them clutching a small remote to adjust the recliner. His life had slowed down drastically in recent months. Late-stage lung cancer had seen to that. But today felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The phone rang, a sound that was both startling and strangely comforting. Joseph's wife, Linda, a petite woman with gray streaks in her short hair, glanced at him from the kitchen. "You want me to get that, Joe?" she asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. He waved her off. "I got it," he said, his voice raspy but firm. His fingers trembled as he picked up the cordless phone from the table beside him. Caller ID wasn't something Joseph cared much for. He still believed in answering every call. "Hello?" he said, his tone a mix of curiosity and exhaustion. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Is this Joseph Reed?" It was calm, deep, and carried a distinct cadence that he recognized immediately. Joseph sat up straighter, his breath catching in his throat. "This is Donald Trump," the voice continued. "I heard about your story, and I wanted to take a moment to call you personally." Joseph blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. He turned toward Linda, who had frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is this really him?" he whispered, covering the receiver with his hand. "Joe, who is it?" Linda mouthed, stepping closer. But Joseph couldn't respond to her. His heart was pounding now, pushing blood through veins that had once survived the jungles of Vietnam, but now barely had the strength to support his weakened body. He leaned back into the chair, gripping the phone tightly as his mind raced. What could Trump possibly want with someone like him? A retired mechanic, a war veteran living out his final days in a small home in Topeka, Kansas. Yet the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Familiar not just from television but from countless speeches Joseph had admired over the years. "Well, Mr. President," Joseph finally said, finding his voice, "I'm not sure what to say. This is unexpected." Trump chuckled lightly. "Sometimes the best moments in life are the ones we don't expect. I've been told you've always supported me, and I wanted to thank you for that. I don't take it for granted." The words hung in the air, leaving Joseph speechless. He glanced at Linda, whose eyes glistened with tears she hadn't realized she was holding back. For the first time in a long time, Joseph felt something stir inside him. Something that felt a lot like hope. "But why me?" Joseph wanted to ask, yet he held back, knowing the answer was just beginning to unfold. The veteran's grip on the phone tightened as he tried to collect his thoughts. "Thank you, Mr. President," Joseph managed, his voice cracking slightly. "I've always believed in what you stand for. It's just an honor to hear from you." "Joseph," Trump said, his tone more serious now, "I've read about your service. Vietnam, right?" "Yes, sir," Joseph replied, sitting up straighter. Despite the years that had passed, the memories of his time in the war were never far from his mind. He could almost hear the sound of choppers slicing through humid skies and smell the acrid scent of burning foliage. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but it was a part of who he was, a part that had shaped him into the man he became. "You sacrificed so much for this country," Trump continued. "I've always said that our veterans are the backbone of this nation, and you're living proof of that." Joseph felt a lump rising in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing words like this, especially not from someone of Trump's stature. For years, he'd battled not just the physical scars of war, but the emotional toll it had taken. He'd watched friends come home only to lose their battles to addiction, homelessness, or the demons in their minds. And now, here he was, at the end of his own fight, hearing gratitude from the very leader he'd admired from afar. "Tell me about your life after the service," Trump prompted. "I want to know about the man behind the uniform." Joseph hesitated. He wasn't one to talk about himself, but something about Trump's voice made him feel like he could. "Well, after the war, I came back to Kansas, married my high school sweetheart, Linda. We've been together ever since. 45 years now." He glanced at Linda, who stood silently in the doorway, her hand over her heart. "I worked as a mechanic for most of my life, opened my own shop eventually. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table." "And your kids?" Trump asked, his tone softening. Joseph's smile faded slightly. "We had one boy, Matthew. Lost him in Iraq, 2005. The words were heavy, but Joseph had grown used to saying them. It didn't make the loss any easier, but it was part of his story, one he carried with him every day. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for Joseph to wonder if he'd said too much. But then Trump spoke, his voice steady. "Joseph, I can't imagine the pain of losing a child. You've given more to this country than most people can comprehend. And yet, here you are, still standing." Joseph felt a tear slip down his cheek. "Some days it feels like I'm not," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you are," Trump countered firmly. "You're a survivor, Joseph, and the world needs to hear stories like yours." The veteran closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. For years, he'd carried the weight of his past, thinking no one truly understood. But in this moment, it felt like someone finally did. The conversation was just getting started, but the weight of the past had set the stage for something far greater. Joseph cleared his throat, trying to steady his emotions. "You know, Mr. President," he began, his voice still trembling, "a lot of people don't understand what it means to sacrifice for this country. It's not just the time or the pain. It's knowing you may never come back the same or at all." Trump let the silence linger for a moment, a rare pause in his usually rapid delivery. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter, more introspective. "Joseph, I think about that more than people realize. About what people like you and your son have given up so that people like me could even have the chance to lead this country. It's humbling." The words surprised Joseph. He hadn't expected Trump to sound so human. For all his public bravado, this side of him was disarming. Trump continued, "You know, my father always taught me that success isn't about money or power. It's about legacy, what we leave behind for others. And hearing your story, it reminds me why I fought so hard. Not just for policies, but for people like you." Joseph nodded instinctively, though Trump couldn't see it. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. "You've got your share of critics," Joseph said cautiously, "but I always believed you cared about this country. That's why I supported you." "I know, Joseph," Trump said, "and I've seen my share of fights too. Not on the battlefield like you, but battles that test your spirit just the same." Joseph frowned slightly. "What kind of battle, sir?" Trump hesitated, and for a brief moment, the line was silent except for the faint sound of breathing. "I don't talk about this often," he began, "but I've faced struggles in my own way. Losing my brother Fred was one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with. He was a good man, but he fought his own demons, and eventually, they got the best of him." Joseph felt a pang of empathy. He didn't know much about Trump's personal life, but hearing this made the man on the other end of the line feel more real. "I'm sorry to hear that," Joseph said softly. "Thank you," Trump replied. "Fred taught me a lot about life, about resilience, about not giving up even when things feel impossible. I think that's why your story resonates with me so much. You've lived through so much, and yet you're still here, still fighting." Joseph chuckled weakly. I don't know about fighting, Mr. President. Some days, it feels more like just holding on. But isn't that the fight? Trump countered. Holding on when everything around you says to let go. The words struck a chord deep within Joseph. He hadn't thought of it that way before. For years, he'd seen his life as a series of losses. Friends, his son, his health. But maybe, just maybe, the fact that he was still here meant something. As Joseph pondered the president's words, he realized this wasn't just a phone call. It was a lifeline, and the conversation was far from over. Joseph's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the phone against his ear. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. For so long, he'd felt invisible. A man whose contributions and sacrifices had been buried beneath the weight of time. And yet, here he was, talking to the former president of the United States who seemed to genuinely care about his story. "I'll be honest with you, Joseph," Trump said, breaking the silence. "People see me as this larger-than-life figure, but they don't see the quiet moments. They don't see the nights when you sit alone and wonder if you're really making a difference." The vulnerability in Trump's voice caught Joseph off guard. He hadn't expected this kind of candor. "I imagine it's not easy, sir," Joseph said, "being in the spotlight like that." "It's not," Trump admitted. "But then I think about people like you. People who gave everything and didn't ask for anything in return. You remind me why I wanted to do this in the first place. It's not about politics. It's about people." Joseph felt a lump rising in his throat again. "I appreciate that, Mr. President. I really do. But honestly, I'm just an old man trying to make peace with the time I've got left." Trump's voice softened. "You're more than that, Joseph. You're a reminder of what this country is about. Resilience, sacrifice, hope. And I think people need to hear your story." The veteran leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the medals and photos that adorned the wall across from him. His bronze star, a black and white photo of him and his platoon, all grinning despite the mud and exhaustion etched into their faces. And then, next to those, a folded American flag, a painful reminder of the son he'd buried far too soon. "I don't know, sir," Joseph said after a moment. "It's hard to feel hopeful these days. My body is failing me, and I don't have much left to give." "You've already given more than most, Joseph," Trump said. "But maybe what you have left isn't about giving. It's about sharing. Sharing your story, your wisdom, your strength. That's the legacy I was talking about." Joseph felt the tears welling up again. He wasn't a man prone to crying, but something about this conversation was breaking down walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. "You think people would care about my story?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't just think it, Joseph. I know it," Trump said firmly, "because your story isn't just yours. It's the story of every soldier who's fought for this country, every parent who's lost a child, every person who struggled and still found a way to carry on." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Joseph closed his eyes, letting them sink in. For so long, he'd felt like his life was winding down to nothing. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. And as that spark began to grow, so did his determination to make the most of whatever time he had left. The conversation wasn't over yet, but Joseph knew it was leading somewhere important. Joseph exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. Not from illness this time, but from the unexpected weight of emotion. He glanced at Linda, who was now sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together, listening intently. She'd always been his rock, but even she seemed moved by this moment, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Mr. President," Joseph began, his voice unsteady, "you've done more for me in this one call than most people have in years. But there's something I want to say, something I've been holding in." Trump remained quiet, giving him the space to speak. When I lost my son, Joseph continued, his voice trembling, I didn't just lose him. I lost a part of myself. I kept asking, why him? Why not me? And over the years, that question has eaten away at me. Some days, it's all I can think about. The room felt heavy with silence, the kind that only comes when deep truths are laid bare. Linda reached out, placing a hand on Joseph's knee, offering silent support. You're not alone in that, Joseph, Trump said after a moment. I've met so many parents like you, strong, courageous, but carrying a pain that most of us can't even begin to understand. But let me tell you something my brother taught me. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight for others. They're the ones we fight within ourselves. Joseph wiped at his eyes, his breathing uneven. I don't know how to win that fight, he admitted. You already have, Joseph, Trump said firmly. Every day you wake up and keep going, you're winning. Every time you share your story, you're helping someone else fight their battle. That's why your life matters. That's why your legacy matters. The words hit Joseph like a bolt of lightning. He'd spent so many years thinking of himself as a man in decline, a man whose best days were behind him. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: pride. Maybe you're right, Joseph said quietly. Maybe there's still something I can do, something I can give. There's no maybe about it, Trump replied. The world needs more men like you, Joseph. Men who remind us of what it means to be brave, to sacrifice, and to keep going even when it feels impossible. Joseph let the words sink in, his mind racing with possibilities he hadn't considered in years. Could he really share his story? Could he use his pain to help others? It was a daunting thought, but also an empowering one. As the conversation moved toward its conclusion, Joseph felt a spark of hope, a hope that even in his final chapter, his story could still be written. The call ended, but its impact lingered in the small living room. Joseph placed the phone down on the side table, his hands still shaking. Linda, unable to hold back any longer, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, her cheek resting against his shoulder. You needed that, Joe, she whispered. I don't know how, but you did. Joseph nodded silently, his mind replaying Trump's words. He felt as though a weight had been lifted, as though he'd been given permission to feel something other than grief. Linda pulled back, her eyes full of determination. People need to know about this, she said. You've always said the world forgets about people like you, veterans, parents who've lost their kids. Well, now they'll remember. Joseph shook his head. I don't know, Linda. I'm not sure I want the attention. It's not about attention, Linda said firmly. It's about showing people that even in the hardest moments, there's still something worth holding on to. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there who's struggling will hear your story and find a little bit of hope. Reluctantly, Joseph agreed. With Linda's help, he reached out to a local news station, sharing his experience with Trump's call. The story spread quickly, first through local networks, then national ones. Within days, the moment had gone viral, with headlines like Trump's emotional call to dying veteran sparks nationwide conversation, plastered across social media and news outlets. The response was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and messages poured in from people all over the country. Veterans who felt seen for the first time, parents who had lost children, even strangers who simply wanted to thank Joseph for his service. For the first time in years, Joseph didn't feel invisible. He felt part of something bigger than himself. One video stood out among the flood of responses. It was a simple clip of a young man, no older than 25, sitting in his car. His face was streaked with tears, his voice shaky as he spoke into the camera. I saw the story about Mr. Reed, the man said, and I wanted to say thank you. I've been struggling a lot lately, thinking about giving up. But hearing what he's been through, how he keeps going, it's given me a reason to keep going too. Joseph watched the video in silence, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't speak, couldn't even move. He just sat there, feeling the weight of what his story had done, how it had reached across miles, across screens, to touch the heart of someone he'd never met. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "See, Joe? You're making a difference, just like he said you would." Joseph nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I never thought anything I did could matter this much." But as the messages kept coming, Joseph began to realize that his story had become a beacon of hope, not just for others, but for himself as well. And the best part? It wasn't over yet. Weeks turned into months, and the story of Joseph Reed continued to resonate. What had started as a private moment between a veteran and a former president had become a movement. Veterans groups reached out, inviting Joseph to speak at events, virtually given his declining health. Schools wanted to include his story in lessons about sacrifice and resilience. And families, strangers from all corners of the country, wrote to him about how his words had changed their perspective. Joseph didn't have the strength to respond to every message, but Linda made sure each one was read aloud to him. Each story of a life touched by his own became fuel for his soul, pushing him through the pain and exhaustion that came with his illness. One day, as Joseph sat in his chair, gazing out the window at the Kansas plains, his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Donald Trump, but a young woman named Sarah, a producer for a major news outlet. She wanted to run a special segment on Joseph's life and his impact, titled "The Legacy of a Soldier's Story." "I'm no hero," Joseph told her. "I'm just a man who did his duty." "That's exactly why your story matters," Sarah replied, "because it shows that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." The interview aired a week later, and it was as raw and honest as Joseph had been throughout his life. He spoke about his time in Vietnam, the pain of losing his son, and the unexpected call that reignited a sense of purpose he thought was lost forever. By the end of the segment, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, not in Joseph's living room, nor in the homes of the millions who tuned in to watch. As his health worsened, Joseph made one final request to Linda. "When the time comes," he said, "I want you to keep sharing the story, not for me, but for everyone out there who thinks they've got nothing left to give." Linda promised she would, her voice thick with emotion. "Your story isn't just yours anymore, Joe. It's theirs now." When Joseph passed away a few weeks later, his funeral was a testament to the lives he touched. Veterans from across the country came to pay their respects, some in uniform, others in everyday clothes, but all with the same gratitude in their eyes. Linda stood strong as she greeted each one, knowing that Joseph's legacy was far from over. In the days that followed, the video of Joseph's phone call with Trump was shared once again, reigniting the conversation about the sacrifices veterans make and the importance of recognizing their stories. The young man who'd recorded the emotional video in his car posted a new one, standing next to a framed photo of Joseph. "I never met him," the man said, "but Joseph Reed saved my life, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to live up to the example he set." Linda smiled as she watched the video, her heart heavy but full of pride. She knew Joseph would have been humbled by the outpouring of love and gratitude. And though he was gone, his story continued to inspire, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. Joseph's journey was more than just a phone call or a viral story. It was a reminder that every life has meaning, and every voice, no matter how quiet, can make an impact. If Joseph's story has touched you, take a moment to thank the veterans in your life. Listen to their stories and honor their sacrifices. And if you've ever doubted your own worth or the value of your story, remember, Even the smallest act of resilience can inspire someone else,